Okay, so hi, my name is Sébastien. I'm a founding member of Historical Materialism Journal and the book series and the conferences, some of which you would already be familiar with. So I wanted just to pitch to you the idea of you subscribing to the journal. Firstly, the journal comes out 4 times a year, published by Brill, over 1,000 pages of extremely important and stimulating Marxist theory and Marxist history. We have a discount at the moment for individual subscribers around the time of the London conference, and we very strongly both request and demand that you subscribe to the journal, that you get other people to subscribe to the journal, and of course that you get your institution, if you're part of a university or other institutions, to subscribe to the journal. We need more subscribers for this project to be able to expand and continue. The second thing I really wanted to push was the book series. The book series you also probably be familiar with. It's published by Brill Academic Press, and all the volumes come out 12 months later with Haymarket Books in Chicago, paperbacks. We have more than 200 volumes published now, of translations of original work, of document collections, of translations from Marxist theory from across the world, from Japan to China, to India, to Latin America, very important Latin American list shaping up in the book series, and so on. It's a really crucial intervention in Marxist literature, in making Marxist theory available. That really hasn't existed on this scale since the 1970s. So we'd like you to look at the book series, buy individual volumes, perhaps take up the offer of the book club that Haymarket is promoting. And also, of course, again, if you're part of an institution, to get your institution to buy as many volumes as possible. Those are the 2 key elements of our activity, aside from the conferences, the journal and the book series. And we think it would be it's essential, basically, for us, for our existence, for us to be able to continue to thrive, for those to expand. So please subscribe to the journal, buy the books in the book series, publicize both around you, and help us build the Historical Materialism project.
Thank you to the animated Sébastien Budgen for welcoming us to this session on Marxism and Political Economy, and thank you to all of you for tuning in and for joining us for what will no doubt be an excellent discussion. So most of the introductory matters have been settled. All I have to do still is to tell you that my name is Sai. I'm an editorial member of Historical Materialism, and I'll be chairing today's session. The way this will work is that I'll briefly introduce the speakers and the title of their papers. We have 3 speakers today. Sébastien Rioux has not joined us. Our 3 speakers will have about 20 minutes each to present their papers, after which there'll be plenty of time for you to ask questions, make comments, and for the speakers to come back to those, as well as for the speakers themselves to come back to each other's papers. In order to do that, you should find on YouTube, in the chat option, the possibility to post questions or make remarks throughout. So don't feel you have to wait till the end. If a speaker says something that you're interested in, please put it in the chat, and at the end I will communicate all your questions and remarks to the speakers so that they can come back to it. We will then get started. So our first speaker today will be Tom Walker from Simon Fraser University in Canada, and his paper is titled Disposable Time, Surplus Population and the Limitation of the Hours of Labor. He will be followed by Javier Zacares from the University of Durham, whose paper is titled Theorising Residential Capitalism, Land Rent, Capital Accumulation, and Housing Provision. And last but not least, Galip Yalman, from the Middle East Technical University in Turkey will present on central banks as hegemonic apparatuses. And just a remark that it should be central banks in your programs. I think it says banks as hegemonic apparatuses, and it should be central banks. So without further ado, we'll now move to our speakers. And Tom, the floor is all yours.
Thanks, Si. I will share my screen here. And there it goes. Okay. One more thing I've got to put on my chat there, I think. Okay, so good morning and good afternoon. My presentation today stems from a 2 decades long engagement with the 1821 pamphlet, The Source and Remedy of the National Difficulties, which according to Engels, Marx rescued from its oblivion. In Time, Labor, and Social Domination, Moishe Postone twice quoted a provocative passage from the Grundrisse that begins, "Capital itself is the moving contradiction." At the end of the paragraph containing that passage, Marx paraphrased and cited The Source and Remedy, etc., 1821. My curiosity about that citation led me to the basement of the UBC library, where I retrieved a microfilm copy of the pamphlet. This is about 20 years ago. And in the ambivalence of disposable time, the source and remedy of the national difficulties at 200, I examined the influence of the pamphlet on Marx's critique of political economy, an influence that has largely gone unacknowledged. My subsequent research is concerned with how Marx's critique really surpassed the source and remedy's already quite formidable critique of political economy. Several times when discussing my essay, I mentioned that the author of the pamphlet, Charles Wentworth Dilke, had a concept of socially necessary labor time, although he didn't call it that, and it was different from Marx's category. Soon I realized I needed to check for myself exactly what Marx's category was about before making any rash pronouncements. The first thing I discovered was that Marx hadn't used the term at all in the Grundrisse, although the germ of the as yet unnamed category was embedded in his discussion of disposable time, the superfluous and the necessary, and relative surplus population. As I rummaged through the Grundrisse for traces of the emerging category, my searches converged on 2 sections that bore lexical and syntactic similarities to crucial passages of the well-known fragment on machines. Consequently, I now argue there is not 1, but 3 fragments on machines. The first 2 illuminate the sense of the terminology Marx used in the third. Okay, so I'd like to outline what I hope will be 3 takeaways from my talk today. First, I agree with Postone that Marx's analysis of the historical specificity of value in the Grundrisse provides a key to interpreting his mature critique of political economy, and that Marx characterizes in the Grundrisse a possible post-capitalist society in terms of the category of disposable time. Second, Postone's interpretation of the superfluous form and of disposable time needs to be amended. The real significance of those 2 terms is revealed gradually over the course of all 3 fragments on machines. Third, disposable time is the foundation of Marx's analysis of surplus value and his crisis theory. Fourth, the theory of surplus population and surplus capital that he develops in the Grundrisse is Marx's crisis theory in a nutshell. Fifth, Marx's analysis of disposable time and his theory of surplus population and surplus capital are relevant to addressing contemporary issues of social disintegration and environmental degradation. Before I continue, I need to say a few words about socially necessary labor time as Marx defined it in Capital. Marx's technological definition of socially necessary labor time refers to the average amount of labor time it takes in society as a whole to produce a unit of a given type of commodity. The average quantity of labor time then determines the value of the commodity. Subsequently, in chapters 3 of volume 1 and again in volume 3, Marx presented a market modification of socially necessary labor time such that if there is not enough demand for the entire quantity produced of a commodity, then it is as if too much time had been spent on the production of each unit. There is some controversy about whether the market modification is consistent with a technological definition. In my view, this controversy is pointless in that it ignores the role of surplus population. The links between the three fragments can best be illustrated by highlighting key words that occur repeatedly and or exclusively in those pages of the Grundrisse. In the Penguin edition, it's pages 397 to 401, 608 to 610, and pages 706 to 708. Disposable time, surplus population, and the superfluous are the conspicuous terms. Disposable time occurs exclusively in fragments 1 and 3. Surplus population occurs mostly in the fragments. Superfluous, paired with either necessary labor time or surplus population, occurs only in the fragments and in all three fragments. The distinctive dialectic of the superfluous and the necessary and its relation to disposable time begins in the first fragment, where Marx established a transhistorical or anthropological frame. I quote, "The whole development of wealth rests on the creation of disposable time. The relation of necessary labor time to the superfluous, such it is initially from the standpoint of necessary labor, changes with the different stages in the development of the productive forces. Under capitalism," Marx continued, "the existence of necessary labor time is conditional on the creation of superfluous labor time. The priority of the necessary and the superfluous is thus reversed in capitalism." By the second fragment, this reversal of the superfluous and the necessary has progressed to include the creation of a relative surplus population as necessary for capital. There, Marx developed the analysis that labor capacity can perform its necessary labor only if its surplus labor has value for capital, if it can be realized by capital. Only a handful of authors have acknowledged the importance of surplus population to Marx's category of socially necessary labor time. Marx himself didn't make the connection explicit in Capital. One scholar who has explored this grim characteristic of socially necessary labor time is Fabian Arzuaga in his essay, Socially Necessary Superfluity, Adorno and Marx on the Crises of Labor and the Individual. See especially the section on producing socially unnecessary human beings. In Anti-Düring, Engels also pointed out the relationship between relative surplus population, crises, and the labor time socially necessary for the production of specific commodity labor power. Speaking of crises, in a passage in the third fragment on machines, Marx presented two lists of items nature does not build: machines, locomotives, railways, electric telegraphs, self-acting mules, etc. And then a bit later, railways, canals, aqueducts, telegraphs, etc. But the second time, he explicitly excluded machinery directly active in the direct production process. Sandwiched between the two lists, Marx drew an analogy between the factors governing the magnitudes of surplus labor in the industries producing consumption goods and the total labor time employed in the production of fixed capital. Investment in the production of fixed capital depends on high productivity in the consumption goods industries to enable the withdrawal of wealth from production for use. Dilk had presented a similar argument in The Source and Remedy. Quote, the possessors of the surplus produce will employ the population upon something not directly and immediately productive, for instance, in the erection of machinery, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Oddly, only the first 6 words of that passage appear in Marx's Capital. That's the only citation of The Source and Remedy in Capital. In his notes on The Source and Remedy in the 1861 to 63 manuscripts, Marx criticized our pamphleteer, as he called him, for overlooking 2 things. As a result of the introduction of machinery, a mass of workers is constantly being thrown out of employment, and capital therefore finds fresh labor for which it can be exchanged without any increase in population. Marx's analogy between surplus labor time in direct production and total labor time in the production of fixed capital zeroes in on the precise point where disproportions arise, leading to crises. As Marx concluded the passage on fixed capital in the fragment on machines, in the constant under and overproduction of modern industry, constant fluctuations and convulsions arise from the disproportion when sometimes too little, then again too much circulating capital is transformed into fixed capital. So Marx expanded on that huge topic elsewhere in the Grundrisse, as William Jeffries discussed in a session of this conference last Saturday on Marx's Forgotten Transformation solution. So I don't need to go into that in my short 20 minutes. In Capital, Marx dealt with this disproportion in 2 places. The chapter on accumulation in volume 1, where he came to the monumental statement that this is the absolute general law of capitalist accumulation, this being the expansion of a relative surplus labor population. And in the chapter on the falling rate of profit in volume 3, in the Penguin edition, that's pages 328 to 330 especially, where he says, in the same proportion as capitalist production develops, there also develops the possibility of a relative surplus working population, not because the productivity of social labor declines, but rather because it increases. That is, not from an absolute disproportion between labor and the absolute disproportion between labor and means of subsistence, or the means of producing those means of subsistence, but rather from a disproportion arising from the capitalist exploitation of labor, the disproportion being the progressive growth of capital and the relative decline in its need for a growing population. In other words, the increasing organic composition of capital. In his inaugural address to the International Working Men's Association, Marx hailed passage of the English 10 Hours Bill as the first time that in broad daylight, the political economy of the middle class succumbed to the political economy of the working class. What might a political economy of the working class look like today? In the wake of the COVID pandemic, Finland, Iceland, Japan, New Zealand, Scotland, and Spain, perhaps others, but those are the ones that I've found, have conducted or announced pilot projects to study the benefits of moving to a shorter work week. Legislation for a 4-day week has been introduced in the United States even. The decades-long plague of precarious work underscores the relevance of Marx's analysis of relative surplus population and capitalist accumulation. Responses to climate change also call for reevaluating the imperative of economic growth and pose reductions of working time as an alternative. Marx's dialectic of the necessary and the superfluous from the Grundrisse is essential for comprehending the logic of capital behind social disintegration and environmental degradation, and developing strategies adequate to address those crises. As an example, advocates of degrowth often prescribe reductions of working time on the grounds that it can be an alternative to economic growth as a way to create jobs to offset the negative employment effects of productivity gains. Marx's analysis of surplus population, however, shows that capitalist economic growth itself necessarily produces relative surplus population, and capital relies on that surplus for expansion. Addressing only the symptoms without understanding the underlying disorder may lead to half measures that perversely get blamed for the problems they failed to solve. The analysis of disposable time and surplus population suggests three ways these proposals could be improved. First, work time reductions could be far more radical than the timid reductions usually proposed. Second, reduction of working time needs to be complemented by reappropriating disposable time to be socially available for the artistic and scientific development of the individuals in the time set free, as Marx says, instead of being passively consumed by isolated individuals in the form of entertainment. And third, the facilities for accessing and communicating general social knowledge need to be recognized as the common pool resources they are, whose enclosure in the name of corporate intellectual property is, strictly speaking, confiscation of wealth that was created by society and should belong to all members of society. In closing, I'd like to caution that Marx's analysis, brilliant as it is, should not be taken as the exclusive source of wisdom about disposable time or the reduction of working time. The source and remedy, of course, was the original on disposable time. The pamphlet's author, Charles Dilke, in turn, was inspired by William Godwin, who was the first to present the case for universal enjoyment of leisure. Within the neoclassical tradition, even, Sidney Chapman's theory of the hours of labor largely confirms Marx's analysis in many respects, but also goes beyond in terms of the analysis of productivity gains from reducing working time, a theme that was pioneered in the 1870s by Thomas Brassey. So thank you very much, and that's it.
Thank you so much, Tom, and thank you for your disciplined timekeeping. We'll now move to Javier. The floors are yours.
Thank you, Sai. I'll try to live up to that amazing paper by Tom. Let me just share my presentation. Hope that is visible. Okay. Oh, sorry. Okay. So my paper is a very rough sketch of the theoretical framework of a monograph that I am working on. And it's called Residential Capitalism, Rise and Implosion in Modern Spain. And as the name indicates, the bulk of the book is an in-depth historization of housing provision in Spain. However, the theoretical aim of the book is to use the Spanish case to extract broader conclusions about how capitalism shapes and is in turn shaped by the process of residential provision. So I will start by framing my contribution with a brief outline of the theoretical problems that I see in the housing studies literature. So first, the study of housing provision is quite simply under-theorized. Housing specialists themselves have long decried the excessive empiricism of their field, which they rightly see as too focused on policy prescription. Second, those theoretical studies that do exist tend to have an excessive emphasis on the consumer side of housing provision. And this means that there is a tendency to limit the analysis to how housing is marketed, with a particular focus on tenure systems and mortgage lending. So less visible aspects of the housing process, such as practices of land speculation or property development, are typically left out of the picture. To me, this neglects the production side and generates a very partial view of how housing fits into capitalism's broader dynamics. From a Marxist perspective, I think capitalism is a mode of production, and therefore we can't really speak of capitalist housing provision unless we take into account how housing is made and not just sold. And then third, finally, I think there is a problem of ahistoricism. There is little or no engagement with questions of historical change in the literature, which is not to say that there aren't great analysis of specific cases. So, for example, accounts of historicizing the British housing market since the 1950s, for example. But there usually is very little theoretical exploration of what these cases indicate about the broader historical relationship between the development of capitalism and the evolution of housing systems. So often analysis stop at a very broad systemic level. So from a Marxist perspective, there's a tendency to just state that, housing bubbles are a function of an underlying crisis of profitability in commodity production. And I think we can go further than this. I think we can go deeper in trying to spell out the connections between housing provision and capitalist development. So my aim overall is to construct a theoretical approach to residential capitalism, which is how I'm calling the historically specific dynamics of capitalist housing provision. And to do so while addressing all three of these problems at once. Okay, to do this, I start from a very basic premise from which I build on later. And my basic premise is that all capitalist social formations are caught between two different but interrelated forms of capital accumulation. One is rent extraction and the other one is capitalist production. Rent denotes the profit derived from hoarding scarce assets in conditions of limited or no competition. It is the income derived from simply owning something that happens to be in demand, irrespective of whether the asset in question is leased out or is sold at a profit. The logic of rent extraction is to keep an asset limited so as to raise its price as much as possible. And historically, rent extraction is a form of accumulation that long precedes capitalism. It is arguably as old as markets themselves. However, it obviously continues to shape capitalist societies. And then, of course, there is capitalist production, the production of surplus value, which is unique to modern capitalist societies. And the logic here is the polar opposite to rent. It involves constantly improving productivity in conditions of competition. The goal here is not to corner a scarce asset, but to engage in cost-efficient production to expand output so as to lower the price of a commodity so you can drive off your rivals from the market that way. Now, both forms of capital accumulation are always necessarily at play in capitalist societies. However, the relationship is ambivalent. Sometimes they will reinforce one another in a symbiotic manner. Other times they will grate against one another in contradictory ways. So then the next question is, how does this ambivalent relationship play out specifically in the housing sector? On the one hand, a house is produced like any other commodity, and therefore it is potentially subject to capitalist production. And indeed, the development of capitalism has meant that housing has come to be built on a mass scale by capitalist contractors who compete with one another by cutting costs in the production process and by controlling the productivity of workers on the construction site. This is an observable historical process that can be traced, I would say, to the early 19th century. Then on the other hand, a house is a landed asset and therefore it yields land rent. Land is the quintessential rent-bearing asset. How a landlord makes its money is by charging as much as possible for the use of limited space. The landed quality of a house is why, unlike other mass-produced commodities, housing does not get cheaper over time. Whereas the price of a smartphone technology can fall in the face of continuous demand, a housing will only get more expensive depending on how on demand the land beneath it is. So if you live in London, this is why you hate your landlord. Now, these two forms of capital accumulation are in many ways the mirror image of one another, but they are not necessarily at contradiction. Often they are carried out by the same economic actor at once. In the realm of housing production, for example, a property developer is a hybrid between a land rentier and a capitalist builder. And this comes with distinct challenges for this type of capitalist as well. A developer buys up urban space, speculating that the worth of its location is going to increase in the future. But at the same time, the developer might well invest in building operations, putting a construction contract to tender, and therefore setting in train the process of competition between building contractors to increase productivity and to make construction cost efficient. In the end, a developer's profit margin depends on the difference between cost-efficient construction and their capacity to inflate the selling price of the building. So their business is simultaneously navigating both forms of capital accumulation at once. There is no necessary contradiction. But there can be a contradiction as well. So ultimately, the developer relies on his or her capacity to pass the rising cost of land and of the housing on top of it onto the customer. If customers can afford the rising cost of housing, then there is no necessary contradiction between land rent extraction and capitalist building production. But this, of course, is a very big if, because the fact that land and thus housing tends to only get more expensive over time creates problems of affordability. Now, mortgage finance may stretch demand capacity, but this presupposes that borrowers will be able to pay back their debts at some point. And at a time like the post-war period, when there was booming growth, full employment, and rising wages, all of this was good and well. But in an era of anemic growth, precarious employment, and stagnant wages, debt-fueled price increases may not be so easy to sustain, as the 2008 financial crisis taught us pretty well. Now, on top of that, if housing only becomes more expensive, then residents will have to dedicate a greater part of their disposable income to housing, which in turn depresses demand for other commodities, and therefore creating problems for other industries. So, of course, squeezed residents may push for a living wage to be able to keep up with housing costs, but an upward pressure on wages will increase the costs for capitalist employers and thus potentially harming their competitiveness as well. Now, all of this means that there are always difficult trade-offs at play in the governance of housing provision. To govern urban formations, states have to develop strategies to balance out the logics of rent extraction and capitalist production in a way that guarantees their economic and political reproduction. And to do so, states need to be able to strike a successful institutional arrangement of some sort that is in tune with the balance of class forces and historical institutions that they govern, but also capable of withstanding global value pressures at once. So it's not just a matter of path dependency. Now, to understand these residential arrangements, I propose starting from the analysis of urban social property relations, which is a modified concept from Robert Brenner. And it is a deliberately broad concept that encompasses the political, economic, and cultural institutions mediating relations of property and domination in a given context. These cannot be defined a priori, they can only be specified with respect to particular contexts. And the point, I would say, is to start from a specific social relationship, so landlord-tenant relations, developer-contractor, household state, and from there map out the concrete institutions regulating their dynamics, branching out from there towards a more global perspective. So in doing so, I think we're able to cast light on how urban formations are fragile and conflict-ridden, and therefore always at risk of breakdown and change. Okay, so I will just finish the last part of my paper with a very brief illustration of how European states have developed different residential arrangements over time to manage the tension between rent extraction and capitalist production in the sphere of housing provision. In the 19th century, the urban areas of Europe were dominated by private landlords who typically also costed property development themselves. So as such, housing provision was dominated by their patterns of landholding and under construction, because landlords only built rentals insofar housing remained sufficiently scarce to make it a profitable investment. This pushed up house rent prices and forced tenants into miserable living conditions. This was also an era of mass urbanization as well, so there was a high demand for housing. And the result was considerable unrest in urban areas. In turn, through the advance of capitalism, though the advance of capitalism cheapened the access to commodities, house rent inflation neutralized much of the positive effects of falling consumer prices on effective demand. So this also generated a problem for the reproduction of capitalist society more broadly. In the 20th century, European states responded to these contradictions by restructuring residential relations on a large scale. And their efforts successfully rebalanced the tension between urban land rent and capitalist housing production, but they did not eliminate the tension. Rather, they temporarily suspended it, with the revenues of the post-war boom essentially papering over the problem. So some countries like the United Kingdom opted for absorbing this tension into the state through the provision of public rental housing. And in doing so, the state assumed the responsibility of raising sufficient tax or export revenue to cost residential provision. Now this, however, led to a fresh set of policy dilemmas. In the social housing sector, rather than as unaffordable housing prices, housing crises simply took on the form of long waiting lists for tenants who were waiting for housing. Now, other states, particularly those who were always incapable or unwilling to pay for social housing to begin with, so think, for example, of fascist Spain, these countries opted for promoting homeownership early on, with other countries following suit when the revenues of the post-war boom ran out of steam. Now, on the one hand, homeownership served to incentivize house building, as building to sell operations, they expand the market for developers and they accelerate the pace of turnover. So they make it easier to sustain large scale investments in construction. On the other hand, homeownership also allowed states to jettison the responsibility of direct provision by devolving land rentier functions onto the residents themselves. Owner occupation essentially turned residents into petty rentiers seeking to pass the rising cost of their landed assets onto the next buyer. Now, the drive to make capital gains from house assets intensified as global capitalism entered an era of surplus finance. In the face of secular stagnation, house price speculation has become a major source of effective demand for homeowners. And this in turn has made the political perpetuation of house price growth an electoral imperative for governments. So once again, this financialized residential formation has not resolved the tension at the heart of capitalist housing provision. It has simply reorganized it. So today we see the residential conflict flare up across residential generations, or between those lucky enough to inherit sufficient property wealth, at least. So the young that don't have enough money to inherit, at least, especially those without that property, are increasingly locked out of the housing ladder. And it is thus unsurprising that the young are increasingly defiant of neoliberal statecraft, which has largely catered to the rentier expectations of the homeowning middle classes. I think I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Javier. I'll now pass on to Galip, and I also understand that Sébastien is joining us. There appears to have been a glitch there, so he'll have the opportunity to speak after Galip. Sébastien, can I ask you to mute yourself, because I can hear the presentation in your background, and I'll bring you in after Galip. Galip, the floor is all yours. You're still muted.
Sorry.
That's all right.
Well, with the calamity of COVID-19 dawning upon the humanity in general, there arose, I think it's plausible to observe, a new round of speculative debates about the future of the capitalist system, from the global to the supranational, if you like, also to the nation-state level. And in that, it is interesting to observe the focus on a particular state institution, i.e. the central banks. And given the conceptualization of financialization as an integral feature of neoliberal capitalism, and the characterization of the state as a major agent of this, what is referred to finance-dependent system of accumulation, central banks emerge as a key component of the power relations in terms of the state-finance nexus. And with the granting of their status within the neoliberal framework as independent agencies, presumably to reduce political discretion in economic decision-making processes, they have been empowered to fulfill the dual tasks of price and financial stability in the context of full capital mobility across the national borders. In fact, a specific role has been attributed to central banks for limiting the ability of governments to run fiscal deficits and accumulate debt. Yet, over the last, roughly speaking, 2 decades, if not a little less, there has been an increasing awareness in the pitfalls of the so-called debt-led strategies of growth, because it has been a traumatic experience for the classes of labor worldwide, as fiscal austerity, expansionary or otherwise, has been at the center of economic policy in the aftermath of the 2008 crisis, where you would observe increasingly public debt to be replaced with ever-growing private corporate debt. And many countries of the developed world, in fact, required central bank intervention to finance these debts, while there was this depiction of this as a debt accumulation regime, creating or paving the ground for a periodic experience of financial crises. The stakes had been considered, in fact, so high that one observer of the scene has called for the transformation of the debt state, because these interventions by the central banks are set to increase wealth inequality, fuel the climate crisis, and destabilize financial markets in the long run. Having been delineated as the linchpins of this global financial system, a diversification of central bank policy goals and objectives is set to be underway. For the classic paradigm of inflation fighting independence seems to be becoming increasingly obsolete, at least for the majority of the Western capitalist countries, which experience a period of deflation with very low interest rates, if not zero interest rates. Furthermore, as both ecological and the COVID crisis have made clear, the neoliberal model of central bank independence cannot be sustained anymore, with calls for central banks to embrace objectives such as climate change abatement, to deal with the increasing inequalities, and calls for redistribution of income in certain manners. In fact, what we are living through was described as a period of unprecedented experimentation in central bank policy. So in that respect, what actually others looking from the point of view of what they call macrofinance studies, an increasingly influential perspective critical of the developments taking place, there is already a new policy paradigm emerging, which they dub as Wall Street consensus, which seeks to transform central banks so that they function as an instrument of, again, what they dubbed as de-risking state. Now, in that context, it is also interesting to observe that in papers such as Financial Times, there will be columns emerging which would argue that central banks can now act to reflect better the costs of climate change, for instance, in the cost of capital, and be instrumental in changing the behavior of the businesses. Such calls seems to be in line with the calls coming from the important academic sort of interventions on the part of certain increasingly well-known scholars, which quote for doing capitalism differently. That is to say, in their view, conditionalities can be put in place for government support to businesses in the light of the experiences derived from the so-called bailing out schemes in the wake of the 2008 crisis, and thus encourage investment in sustainable growth and a reduced carbon footprint. In fact, such calls will also be reflected by members of, for instance, Executive Board of the European Central Bank, who would call for and repeat for the notion of sustainable finance that aimed, quote, transforming finance to finance the transformation to green economy. In a sense, if I could make a little longer quote from the same member of the Executive Board of the European Central Bank, quote, a central bank that is responsive to the needs of its citizens has a duty to be mindful of the demands of sustainable development in order to ensure stability in all its forms. First and foremost, monetary stability, but financial, environmental, and social stability too. In short, it is possible, in my view anyway, to interpret these calls for regaining, if you like, in Gramscian terms, moral and intellectual leadership on the part of the central bankers, presumably functioning as organic intellectuals. And to the extent that there is this perception put forward, or if I could correctly summarize it, that public interest and financial stability being aligned with the pursuit of the so-called macroprudential policies, the aspiration to ensure the financial system used for the benefit of our collective well-being could thus be seen as signifying a new historical block in the making, if you like. This in turn brings back, in my view, for those of you who are familiar with the debates from a critical point, political economy perspective in the wake of the 2008 crisis, bringing back into the debating agenda whether the present crisis that we're living through should be conceived as a crisis in or of neoliberalism, as it had been pointed out, as I said, a decade earlier. And in that context, it becomes apparent that the specific roles attributed to central banks imply, if you like, their constitution as hegemonic apparatuses. That is to say, as institutions that organize, mediate, and confirm the hegemony of a particular class, and by functioning as a social and ideological terrain upon which ideas, beliefs, values, and practices are contested, they, if you like, play a crucial role in reproducing common sense and maintaining its dominance as a mode of thought. However, it was also recently observed that there are also those critics from the mainstream economics discipline especially, who worry that pursuing other objectives on the part of the central banks will jeopardize their independence. In other words, it is plausible to think that there are currently competing hegemonic projects, at least two, if not more. However, as incisively observed for the paradigmatic case of the New Right hegemony in the 1980s by Professor Andrew Gamble, which I feel like quoting a bit in length. Quote, "The success of a hegemonic project is not to be measured by the actual achievement of objectives, but rather by the extent to which a significant proportion of both the objectives and the priorities and the means to achieve them advanced by a particular group become endorsed and shared by other groups within the society," end quote. Now, if there is an interest and questions, I could argue that the recent Turkish episode in terms of the relationship between a government and a central bank provides a very good example of it. And in a sense, the notion of central bank independence becomes a key plank of opposition, both intellectual and party political, in terms of restoring the independence of the central bank in the wake of the encroachments by the government concerned, thus confirming the hegemony of the neoliberal mindset so as to maintain the international credibility for the economic policy making. In that respect, I think that the Turkish case, among others, could be considered quite a good example in terms of these so-called competing hegemonic projects, not simply to be understood at the global level or in the context of European Union at the supranational level, but also examples that could be derived from nation state level. At the same time, there are, if you like, what I could describe as left institutionalist accounts, among which this contemplation of a new policy paradigm, as I referred to, so-called Wall Street consensus they refer to, which tend to depict central banks, generally, quote, as an apparatus that contains many different instruments and that can therefore be deployed in pursuit of several different goals. While their argument for Wall Street so-called consensus, something which they would try to develop a stance against, nonetheless, they also play with the idea whether central banks can be turned into, quote, progressive institutions. In other words, reclaiming the fiscal and monetary power of the state and mobilizing it in the service of progressive goals. In other words, whether they argue the power of central banking could be harnessed towards newly imagined social ends, thereby facilitating a transition to economies where uncertainty and hardship are diminished for the people at large. Now, interesting about these sort of arguments, although they tend to be critical of the way in which what they consider this neoliberal insistence on independence of central banks continued on the part of what they refer to Wall Street consensus. Nonetheless, what we are presented, in fact, is nothing but another example of the conception of the state, both as a subject and an object, which had been duly criticized decades ago by important Marxist state theorists such as Nikos Plansas, yet seems to be making comeback over and over again. And in this particular case, on the part of this advocates of critical macro finance studies, because otherwise it would not be possible to come to terms with their depiction of the relationship between state and finance, where the ultimate source of the power of finance will be identified as the state. And in that respect, they will also be talking in terms of turning the financial system into a utility-like sector geared towards the public good, and thus call for socialization of central banks. Now, this is interesting because they have apparently this conception of the state as the source of power belies what again Plansas underlined, the need to avoid conceptualizing state power as something distinct from class power, and no need in that respect to understand the ways in which strategic selectivities of particular historical instances come about and try to be implemented, and at the same time resisted. So this, if you like, conception of the or the debate about the role, changing roles of the central banks gains, I think, importance in terms of rethinking necessary in terms of how to understand the role of the capitalist state and its different forms in relation to the state, as well as in relation to the classes, as well as in relation to its role in a market economy. And I should also mention that while there are these debates going in, if you like, what one could consider as competing hegemonic projects, there were emerging on the part of the so-called guardians of the capitalist system, so-called Bretton Woods sisters, studies which contend that central bank independence is correlated with increasing inequalities in the economy and society, as it has been put forward by a recent World Bank study in the midst of the pandemic crisis. Why? Because according to that paper, at least, central bank independence indirectly constrains fiscal policy and weakens the government's ability to engage in redistribution, incentivize governments to deregulate financial markets, and leads them to contain inflationary pressures in such a way that weakening the bargaining power of the working people. At the same time, there is, if you like, a schizophrenic attitude on the part of the other Bretton Woods institution, the IMF, while calling for equitable growth, etc., or inclusive growth, sometimes referred to, it was still considering the independence of the central bank as a key premise, at least for the countries implementing its stabilization programs, thus underlining IMF's adherence to this already existing long-lasting neoliberal framework. Therefore, I believe, to the extent that financial stability is proclaimed as a major objective of central banks, signifying the dominance of finance, it becomes debatable whether such attempts to do capitalism differently would actually bring forward any paradigmatic shift. However, it is also important to argue that there is a need for a paradigmatic shift about the ways in which the capitalist social orders could be contemplated so as to provide the theoretical underpinnings for political strategies to transform rather than perpetuate them, however, in a rather different manner. So I believe we seem to be embroiled in what Brodel had long ago underlined as an essential feature of the history of capitalism, that is its capacity for change and adaptation, especially in times of crisis.
Thank you so much, Galip, for that paper. And now, last but not least, we'll have Sébastien Rioux from the Université de Montréal in Canada, who will present a paper, The New Scramble for Africa, Land Ownership, Agrarian Change, and the Real Subsumption of Africa to Capital. We'll stretch the session a little bit, Sébastien, because of the misunderstanding. I stretched everybody else's time. So if I could encourage you to stay closer to 15 minutes as possible, that would be ideal, so that there's still time for sort of comments and reactions afterwards.
No problem. I'll make sure to be short. So thanks again and thanks to all the HM organizers for putting this together. This is a lot of time and effort, so I think it's much appreciated by everybody. So turning to the new Scramble. So the population of sub-Saharan Africa, which is now 1 billion strong, is expected to double by 2050. As of now, 63% of its population is rural. One key aspect of the subcontinent is that very little of it is subject to formal entitlements in land. It is estimated that land titles represent about 10% of the total regional land area. And in fact, most of the land is held under village-based customary regimes. In fact, these customary systems of land use embrace 75% of sub-Saharan Africa. Even when we subtract the several million hectares of protected areas considered state assets, this still amounts to an astounding 1.7 billion hectares, most of which are collectively owned and used. During the 2007-2008 World Food Price crisis, the number of individuals suffering from hunger increased from about 800 million to 1 billion, causing unrest, as you probably know, in more than 40 countries. Although there was always enough food to feed the hungry, institutions of global governance responded to the crisis by calling for yet another expansion of food production. In this respect, the World Bank and the FAO, the Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations, so the World Bank and the FAO have been quite active in the identification and justification of new agrarian frontiers. Although a country such as Colombia is likely to become an agricultural regional powerhouse in the future, the most promising agrarian frontier in terms of scale is in sub-Saharan Africa. In a recent report entitled Awakening Africa's Sleeping Giant, the World Bank argued that, quote, reducing poverty in Africa will depend largely on stimulating agricultural growth, end quote. The report is part of a larger study called Competitive Commercial Agriculture for Africa, the title of which clearly states its main objective. The most important agrarian frontier identified by the World Bank and the FAO is the Guinea Savanna Zone, which represents a vast area of African savanna land spreading across 25 countries, stretching from Senegal to Western Ethiopia and from South Sudan to South Africa. This vast area covers some 600 million hectares of land, 2/3 of which are, according to the FAO, ripe for commercial farming. For the World Bank, Africa's Guinea Savanna Zone is one of the largest underused agricultural reserves in the world. While the literatures on land grabbing and the geography of resources have played a vital part in documenting the current land rush and its consequences on peasant and rural communities, it has been less attentive to the broader effects of this continental transformation on land ownership. It would be my argument that what we are seeing is the emergence of a new scramble for Africa that is based on transforming customary land laws and regulations into private ones. It is the ownership status of these lands which is at stake, as both the state and communities claim to be owners. While the state's approach to land tenure is based on imported European norms inherited from colonialism, communities look at customary laws that predate the arrival of Europeans on the continent. Despite these opposite views, what we see is a host of new initiatives and projects funded by the World Bank and other international development organizations, mapping existing land systems and studying land use and regulations in Africa, with the explicit purpose of constituting state-based registers of land ownership. These cadastre aims to formalize land ownership and use and create a land market through the gradual commodification of land. So far, the process of titling and registration has proven problematic for the populations. Only 7 states recognize customary land holding as real property, especially in fact Ghana, Mozambique, Uganda, Tanzania, South Sudan, and Burkina Faso and South Africa. And despite the fact that formal title extinguishes all customary rights, the reality is that most Africans do not have the capacity to alienate or lease their lands. In Africa, as elsewhere, the law has been used to transform the continent into a terra nullius, that is, a land without owners. The 19th century scramble for Africa gave European colonial powers full ownership over the land and resources. As states gained their political independence in the post-war era, however, most governments remained the effective owners of African lands. In fact, most post-colonial states left on title lands the property of the state without recognizing customary laws over land use. In short, legal denial of customary land interests as amounting to real property turned most of the rural population in sub-Saharan Africa into tenants of the state. This leads me to argue that the legal denial of customary rights over land constitute a new scramble for Africa that is at once different from and in continuity with the 1884-1885 Berlin Conference, during which Africa was divided up amongst European colonial powers. On the one hand, it is in continuity because European conceptions of property and land are used to accelerate the process of land dispossession by extinguishing customary claims to land ownership. On the other hand, the current process is different in the sense that it is no longer the colonizers, but the post-colonial states themselves that are selling and leasing lands. This is particularly useful for foreign companies and governments, as they do not have to deal with existing land rights. In this respect, governments in the region often contribute to the cycle of dispossession and primitive accumulation. More specifically, however, I would argue that what is truly different about the current land rush is that it constitutes a transition from the formal to the real subsumption of land under capital. At first, capital sees existing land tenure system, which we might call formal subsumption. It is only by monopolizing the means of production, that is, by transforming customary lands into private property, that land becomes a commodity compelled to behave according to the imperative of capital accumulation. This is the real subsumption of land under capital. I conclude by saying that the World Bank is right in saying that because of such dramatic changes, Africa is most likely to play a key role in global food production over the next decades. While it is difficult to say how exactly these processes will evolve in the near future, I think that it is safe to say that we are witnessing the beginning of profound changes in Africa. I'll stop there, knowing that time is short, and we'll have more time for discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sébastien, for both that paper and an extreme discipline in your timekeeping. I'm very grateful indeed. So thank you so much to all four of our speakers. There's now time for questions, for remarks. I'll invite participants to post those in the chat on the YouTube page. You should find it either next to or underneath your screen, depending on how big you've expanded it. And as I said before, I'd also welcome speakers themselves to comment on each other. If you have questions or remarks, etc., you can indicate, and I'll bring you in to do so. And I would particularly encourage you to indicate if you do have such questions, given we haven't received any questions in the chat yet on YouTube. And so perhaps while people are gathering their thoughts, I could encourage you to react to each other. I feel like Javier was moving forward to the screen to say something. Tom, yes, please.
Oh, I'm just unmuting, so I'm ready.
Oh, sorry. You made me jump on the occasion. I'll maybe give people a little bit of time to gather their thoughts.
Yeah, I will say it was amazing how all of our talks kind of came together, and you know, thinking about that as a whole, the banking and the housing and the surplus population all interacting, and the land.
Yes, I agree. I thought that was very striking. I mean, I sort of had but I don't know if it's an unfair question. So you're allowed to all ignore it if you feel like it. But I have to say that listening to you, I very much agree that there were these kind of overlapping concerns and interests, and a very strong sense of kind of structural and ongoing contradictions that kind of capital or that underline the existence of capitalism. But perhaps also an absence, it seemed to me, of what this might mean in terms of, I guess, the second part of Marx and Marxism's contributions, the possibility of moving beyond capitalism, right? What these contradictions might mean for the different kind of movements. I mean, that's the other thing I think that's striking in terms of dispossession, of housing, of the question of surplus populations, etc., is the fact that these are all quite central questions in terms of struggles against capitalism for the moment, and potentially even more than you know, struggles in the field of production, or certainly more visibly than struggles in the field of production. And so throughout your kind of talks, I was sort of wondering whether you have insights in what that might mean in terms of these struggles and the ongoing kind of attempts at moving beyond the system as it exists. But like I say, also recognize that's not necessarily what your papers were about. So you're, maybe it's an unfair question. Javier, you speak.
Yeah, I have a two-part question for Sébastien. First, I was really interesting paper. Thank you for that. It is fascinating to see this this new neo-colonial enclosure and the dynamics of that in sub-Saharan Africa. I was wondering if you could maybe detail a little bit more what are the possibilities for turning sub-Saharan Africa into the cutting edge of let's say agrarian capitalist production? What are the technical possibilities, and what do these global governance institutions see as the margin for improving production in that region? And then second, I wanted to tie it in with the theme of surplus population, which is that, of course, if we're seeing a new enclosure on a continental scale in sub-Saharan Africa, predictably what's going to happen is that people will be forced off the land, productivity will increase relative to the number of laborers, and then we will see mass migration, presumably to the cities or abroad. And then that obviously poses the political dilemma for the post-colonial sub-Saharan states, which is, what do you do with that population? It seems to me that there's very little prospects of industrialization in sub-Saharan Africa. And even if there were, how much labor could the new industries absorb, given the stage of capitalist development in which we are, in which, can you really absorb that surplus population? And are these sub-Saharan states considering that possibility? What will we do with the urban poverty that will emerge from this?
Yeah, but thank you. Very, very good question. In terms of possibility or the feasibility, I would tend to say that it is quite the whole problem right now for investment in agri businesses is the issue of land rights. No companies or no investors in their right mind will put millions of dollars into agrarian ventures if they do not have the certainty that their investment will be protected by the state, or at the very least that the land on which their investment is sowed, literally, will be available. So, and what is interesting here is that the World Bank and the FAO are not even pretending that that this kind of agrarian industrialization will occur from within these states. That is to say, from let's say capitalist in those states. What they are actually trying to prepare is land to formalize land rights, so that foreigners and foreign investors can actually come in. As for the I would say the technicality of it, the soil is extremely productive. Given that it's a lot of these lands are already in a kind of a savanna type of state, it makes it quite easy in a sense to transform into a cultivated land. Of course, infrastructures will have to be developed, roads and roads and ports. But in terms of feasibility, we already see it as not too much of an issue, so to speak, with the kind of global land rush that has been happening and land grabbing that has been happening for at least 20 years. What we are witnessing, I think, it's something like a kind of rescaling of that process, something to be much more formal and organized. The second question, surplus population, very, very, very interesting question again. I think part of the answer is that the idea, at the very least, of most of these states is that this will bring development within the rural areas, so that there will be part of the population will be absorbed by remaining on the land, giving them wage labor, working for big companies and so on and so forth. And so that and that's the thinking, that this should control a bit like migration to the cities. At the same time, I think it's very unlikely that this will be only a labor-intensive approach. Massive amounts of money, mechanization, all the kind of green revolution type of stuff that we've seen for over 50, 60 years now, will definitely make labor redundant, which is the whole point, especially given that those new agrarian spaces are dedicated almost fully to export markets. So yeah, I think in the end, we are likely to witness a massive migration in terms of urbanization. And I fully agree with you. There are very little prospect of industrialization at the level that could absorb so that will probably just fuel the informal economy even more. Has the backcountry become more and more capitalized, which is a very strange, that could be a very strange development in the history of capitalism in a sense. But yeah, we'll see where it goes. But yeah, surplus population, I think will be, and and I'll finish with that. It's what is interesting is that there's no surplus population like right now. A lot of these communities are autonomous in many ways, not all the time, but like to a certain extent in terms of food production. And now they will be made. There's a surplus population in the making in this sense.
Thank you, Sébastien. I see that Tom would like to come in as well, so I'll let him come in. And then Galip, there's a question to you in the chat from now Finn, who is asking if you could expand on the current role of the central bank in Turkey as a contested hegemonic project. So Tom, and then Galip.
Yeah, just to follow up on that question to Sébastien. We're aiming questions at him since he has such a short time to present. But I'm wondering how the World Bank strategies, like what climate change, to what degree climate change is taken into account in looking at the suitability of the land for agricultural development, industrial agricultural development.
Galip?
Well, hello, Niall. Niall happens to be a former student of mine. Nice to see him again, albeit this way. Yes, it's the peculiarity of the Turkish debate regarding the central bank became very politicized, so to speak, at the same time, but has very little to do in terms of the debates taking place beyond Turkey. I mean, in terms of what I tried to very inadequately, presumably, summarize in terms of the debate, what I refer to in terms of alternative hegemonic projects regarding central banks and their future role, etc. Whereas in the Turkish context, it's, there is this market rationality represented by central bank and being encroached upon and increasingly set aside by a rather authoritarian regime. So in a sense, there are calls for re-establishment of central bank independence as a way out of the crisis, without really paying any attention at all to the debates about the role of the central banks in regarding the inequalities, climate change, etc., etc. So if you go back to the market rationality or what is considered as such, then all our problems in that respect will be solved and return to the so-called price stability mandate will be considered important from the point of view of the people suffering from protracted crises, declining living standards, increasing poverty, etc., because inflation is considered as an enemy number one. So if you bring inflation under control, if you maintain price stability, that will be to the benefit of the people at large. So this is the peculiarity of the Turkish debate, and this, I think, requires quite a bit of, how shall I say, efforts on the part of those who would not necessarily would like to be sort of put into the straitjacket. Either you go for neoliberal independent central banks or suffer the consequences of an authoritarian regime. That's the peculiarity of the Turkish debate over the last couple of years, and increasingly so over the last few months, because as you might be aware, Turkish lira is going down the hill and losing its value rapidly, etc. Why? Because the Turkish central bank is doing what is required, in fact, doing exactly the opposite, and rather than raising the rates of interest, bringing it down, so causing an outflow of capital and thus undermining the value of the Turkish lira. So that's the peculiarity. I mean, it's, and mind-boggling debates takes place within that context. And the party of opposition thinks that the way out for them is go back to the independent central bank. So it's unbelievable, but this is how things are, unfortunately, at the moment.
Thank you for that. And Sébastien, if I can join in the sort of pile up on you, listening to your response to Javier, I was just wondering if you have any insight in terms of, I was listening to what you're sort of saying in terms of what the future might look like, and it really strikes me as quite similar to the sort of process of the last 30 years in much of North Africa and the Middle East, to the kind of structural adjustment programs that both saw very rapid dispossession in the countryside with effective deindustrialization through privatization, etc., in the cities. But that doesn't only lead to migration, although it certainly does, but also to massive structural instability, which the ruling class has neither the interests nor the ability, perhaps, to actually deal with. And then you enter this kind of very long and continuing period of instability in which there is a real structural crisis that difficult to see how the kind of state could, manage its way out of in any kind of way. So I wonder whether there's, whether you see that parallel as useful, or whether there's kind of important, differences, etc., that I'm simply unaware of.
No, I think that the parallels with the structural adjustment policies is quite on the point. In fact, a lot of people during the 80s and 90s, it was kind of a subject of vexation for a lot of countries to experience a kind of recolonization of their economy, as they were selling massively state-owned companies and so on and so forth, and then they were actually returning back to a kind of resource economy where they were basically shipping only commodities with very little value added to it, returning to primary type of exports and so on and so forth. So yeah, I do think that what we are witnessing is just in kind of the continuation of this, but at the same time, suddenly the World Bank, and the FAO are seeing more and more land as a a source of development. And this is, and for a lot of states which are have been structurally adjusted and who have very little basis for their own financing, their own on a yearly basis. This is the promise of probably they are expecting development from it, money coming in, being able to fund the infrastructures. A lot of governments, even with the land grabbing, China has been quite active at that level, but they will come in with like packages of where they will build bridges and roads and ports and so on and so forth. So this kind of land rush is also part of a long, as you were mentioning, a long history of dispossession and structural instability in these countries. So much that now capital is revaluing these lands. They are hoping to benefit from it, but I think it speaks of a kind of mess we're in many ways. As for Tom's question regarding global climate change, World Bank is quite aware of the situation, especially given that we can expect levels of rainfall to diminish, and I can only think that the World Bank will just ask for more technological fixes through manipulation of the grains and like trying to have production that is more water, like can experience water stress and what have you. But yeah, it's always the same. The Green Revolution has always been the same type of how to say, of answers to the same questions. Like this will just be a bit more capital intensive in terms of research and development within agriculture itself. So I'm expecting biotechnology to be very important in the near future in this sense. I have a question for Javier, but I don't know if it's a good time or. Yes, so I really liked your presentation, and you had this this kind of periodization where we saw from 1910s up to the 1970s, roughly, a kind of counter, like a public agenda for making sure that there was affordable housing, and it made me think of kind of Polanyian double movement here. And I'm not sure this is exactly what you want to argue, but I was wondering if is there something, do you see it as an interesting, especially because in urban studies, Polanyi has often been mobilized for good or bad, but I was wondering where you sit on that. Do you think it's an interesting or good way of framing things, or do you see it as having its own limits to think about the kind of transformation that you're talking about?
Should I respond? Yeah. So an interesting observation. I think that Polanyi can be useful when discussing the period, that transition from, say, the 19th century to the 1910s, right? I mean, it's the period that Polanyi was theorizing from. So I think there is use to his notion of embedding and disembedding to examine that era. But if you want to turn his analysis, and sort of make the double movement this transhistorical thing, this almost like pendular dynamic, where basically markets are embedded, and then there's limits to accumulation, and they're disembedded, but then that has really disruptive effects, so they're embedded again. I think you miss out the long-term secular development of capitalism when you take that into account, right? As I was saying, the re-embedding, if you will, of housing in the 20th century was essentially sustained by states relying on their capacity to tax the export boom of the post-war period and use that to paper over the tensions in the provision of capitalist housing. We are not living through a post-war boom, so the ability of states to raise that kind of the kind of tax revenue that would take is more limited. So I don't know that the possibilities for reform, for re-embedding, are not the same. The pendulum is not on the same level anymore. So in that sense, I think that the Polanyian revival in urban studies, which has a really socio-democratic flavor, I think reflects this optimism, which I think is misguided. I don't think that that's on the cards, but maybe history could prove me wrong. Yeah, we never know.
Thanks, Javier. And there's immediately another question for you from Maya Pal in the chat, who asks, what is the specificity of rent as a difficult process to theorize, which is linked to the issues of time and labor explained in Tom's presentation. And by the way, Tom, I don't know if at some point you'd like to come back. It's striking how much you seem to have sort of set up a theoretical framework for the other papers to then engage with empirically, as well as theoretically. Maybe you'd like to kind of comment on some of that. And Maya is also using the opportunity, Javi, to encourage you to say something about the book in the process.
Okay, so in terms of the specificity of rent as a difficult process to theorize linked to time and labor, I would say that the dynamic that Marx is trying to tease out in the Grundrisse and Capital, and that Tom's presentation was talking about, is obviously the side of capitalist production, right? Is this dynamic of the production of relative, the production of surplus value, and especially relative surplus value, the release of a surplus population, the constant deflationary effects that has on the material output that is increasingly released by capitalist social formations. Rent, in a sense, is the mirror image of that. It's a countervailing thing that I would say was the norm in pre-capitalist markets. It was essentially, what Marx calls buying cheap and selling dear, or using some kind of political privileges or monopolies to essentially hoard the supply of assets and therefore generate an inflationary drive that the owners of those assets could ride to make profit that way. To me, so if rent was the norm before capitalism, it hasn't obviously disappeared under capitalism, but the competitive productivity dynamics of capitalist production have sort of come in the last few centuries, and that sort of alters the relationship with rent. So when there is a crisis of profitability, capitals might flee to the safety of rent because they deem that an enclosed asset that they can hoard up to drive up their price in a context of falling rates of profit or depreciating commodities, they can make profit that way. And I think this is exactly what we're living through with housing, right? There is, in the context of the sort of secular crisis, the saturation of global markets for manufactured goods. There is an excess of historical capital that has been accumulated and is taking up the form of finance and is being pumped into asset markets all over. And housing is the quintessential example of that. So essentially, it's as if in my presentation, I was talking about how in capitalist social formations, both dynamics of capital accumulation are always at play. It's as if with capitalist production reaching a point of exhaustion, let's say, by the 1970s, the balance between both forms of capital accumulation has tilted increasingly towards rent. Right, so in a way, capitalist production is decreasingly dominant in capitalist social formations, let's say, and that is not so much well, yeah, I think it has to do with the own secular evolution of capitalism itself. So I don't know if that answers Maya's question. And yeah, then I see that Tom wants to come back. And the contribution of the book, well, the book uses this theoretical observation to sort of build a framework for the analysis of capitalist housing provision. I don't want to take up too much time, but yeah, essentially I explore how this poses different dilemmas for capitalist states and how different forms of social property relations have to be mobilized and articulated and transformed over time to grapple with these this underlying tensions that they have to face. I won't go into detail about that. I think I'll let Tom speak if that's okay with Maya.
Just before, Javier, do you already have a title, a date, a publisher for our listeners to look out for?
Yeah, so the book is called Residential Capitalism, Rise and Implosion in Modern Spain. The timeline is from roughly 1834 to 2020. That's the timeline of the book. I'm under contract with the Ripe series in Global Political Economy. Publication date TBD. But for the time being, I would be submitting the manuscript in late 2022. Fingers crossed that that I will meet that deadline. But yeah, that gives you a rough timeline.
Brilliant. So our viewers and listeners can sort of pace their impatience to know when they can rush to buy it. And then Tom, I'll bring you in, and I think you'll be our last contributor today. So you can also wrap things up for us so that we don't run into the preparation for the next session. So the floor's all yours.
Yeah, just really briefly that, and this is the part that I left out for time consideration. It's a very large part. Is that it's a theory of surplus population and surplus capital, and so what is happening as it's the tendency of the law of the tendency of the falling rate of profit, is that it is not profitable for small capitals to invest in productive activity. So you have the coexistence of surplus population with surplus capital. So the surplus capital doesn't just sit there, it goes into speculative activities. And so Marx describes this surplus capital as being involved in stocks, swindles, speculation, and all of those kinds of essentially non-productive activities. And I think we're in an era of an increasingly unproductive capital investment. It's not going into production, it's going into speculation and driving land values up and creating the search for new land to do this land speculation on.
Thank you, Tom. I'm afraid that Javier wants to steal the last word from you, but I'm going to let him. He'd like to come back to my first question.
Yeah, I just in terms of the possibilities for struggle, I thought that it would be a nice way to finish by combining the themes that have come up in all presentations. So obviously, what we're seeing nowadays is that the labor productivity increases that have built up historically over the course of capitalist development has made labor increasingly redundant. It has destroyed possibilities for employment and has released a massive surplus population while simultaneously saturating the possibilities for profit. This is where we are now. I mean, there could be a miracle and a post-war boom or some sort that is unexpected, but it's very, very unlikely to pull off a new wave of Schumpeterian growth. It's looking like. Now, as I said, I think that this tilts the balance of capital accumulation away from capitalist production and towards rent. And this means that these historically accumulated capitals are becoming increasingly, they're pumping up asset prices, as Tom was just saying. Now, the limits to capitalist growth that we're seeing which are described as a secular stagnation in the mainstream literature, I think they also create new possibilities for struggle in the kind of way that, for example, Aaron Benanav discusses in his recent book. So as capital takes on the form of rent, it becomes harder to sustain the idea that there isn't enough wealth to go around, right? There is an evident excess of material wealth that is just being hoarded up by rentiers, and this should hopefully, create the possibility for programs of massive redistribution, and at the same time, it opens up the idea that, well, perhaps we could live quite decent material lives without having to work so much or at such a fast pace, and also the increasing reliance of capital on services due to the exhaustion of productive activities. Once, say, rent prices are deflated, and then most of the economic activities that would be left would probably be services that are hard to mechanize and to automate. Then we could also envision a society in which labor doesn't have to follow a socially necessary labor time to produce ever faster, because if we were to automate services, things like the care industry or something like that, it would be a really undesirable outcome, right? We don't want these activities to be necessarily mechanized. So I think it opens up, in the horizon, a new kind of form of service redistributive society that is oriented towards, as Tom was saying, the arts, research, care, that sort of stuff. If we manage to survive the climate apocalypse, that could be a possibility for the future, hopefully.
A careful but optimistic final note. Let me just thank everyone for having tuned in. Let me thank Paul for all the kind of heavy lifting on the organization and technical side of both the conference and this session. And of course, thank Galip, Tom, Javier, and Sébastien for their brilliant papers and the very stimulating conversation afterwards. Just to remind our viewers that HM is first and foremost a publication, that we would very much like to encourage all of you to subscribe to it. You get a 20% discount during the conference, which is quickly running out. So please do so immediately. You can do that on the website. And also to remind you that for the next 37 hours, something like that the conference is still running, there is a 40% discount on the HM book series at Haymarket, and at Haymarket are very kindly hosting these sessions for us. And so to also rush to their website to order the hundreds of volumes of the HM book series before the discount runs out. So thanks everyone, and see you at 3 o'clock UK time for our next session.